Now hear these words of welcome from Laureate Furman's director, Nancy Kennedy.
Good evening and welcome to Straight Talk, presented by the Riley Institute and the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, or OLLI, here at Furman. As she said, I'm Nancy Kennedy, director of OLLI, and I am proud to be part of this program that provides non-credit academic courses, social events, travel opportunities, and much more to more than 2,000 senior adults in the Greenville area. We do this with a small staff and an army of dedicated member volunteers. We all know that learning never retires. Since 2011, OLLI has joined the Riley Institute each summer to present a series examining critical issues facing our community, our state, and nation. These events are always informative and compelling, and this year's series, A New Climate Movement, Acting on Solutions That Work, will be as well. I'm glad to see all of you here and would like to offer a special welcome to tonight's speakers, as well as Secretary Dick Riley, the Riley Institute's Chief Inspiration Officer, who served 2 terms as Governor of South Carolina and 8 years as U.S. Secretary of Education. If you would please, take out your cell phones and make sure they're silenced, and then keep them out, because in just a few minutes we're going to ask you to use them to answer a 1-question poll. I hope you enjoyed the artwork in the lobby and that you'll join me in thanking the Furman students who provided it. I'd also like to thank the Department of Earth, Environmental, and Sustainability Sciences and the Shy Institute here at Furman for lending their expertise as we worked to bring this program together. And now I'd like to welcome to the podium Dr. Matt Cohen, Professor of Sustainability Science and moderator for this year's Straight Talk, to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Nancy. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. As a faculty member here at Furman, working with our sustainability science major, I have the pleasure to work with passionate students, colleagues, and community members to uncover pathways towards solving pressing sustainability challenges, one of them being climate change. Can't hear me. Let's try that again. How's that? As I was saying, I can hear myself now. As I was saying, one of the major issues then that we're concerned about is climate change, and I'm happy to be here tonight to kick off a 3-part series to work through these challenges with you all. It's wonderful to see you all here. As we embark on this series, I do want to remind us that we're all at different points of our journeys towards understanding and confronting the climate crisis. We have a wonderful program for you all, through which I think we will better understand the severity of what we face, but also begin to learn about solutions to these challenges and maybe aspire to authoring a more positive future. Tonight, we have some amazing speakers to share their research and perspective on this critical issue. Our keynote speaker this evening, Dr. Angel Xu, not long ago was a college student like many of you in this room. Furman students, I'm talking about pathways, so listen up. While studying the tropical rainforests of Costa Rica, she realized, what does it really matter if the rainforest isn't here in another 10 to 20 years? Thus began her deep interest in policy and how to apply research to pressing environmental issues, leveraging science into the policy domain. Sounds like a liberal arts dream. She added a political science major to her biology degree at Wake Forest University, went on to Cambridge, where she received a master's of philosophy and environmental policy, and then to Yale for a PhD in environmental studies. After several years teaching and conducting research at Yale, she came back to the South and is now at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she now is Assistant Professor of Public Policy and Environment, Energy, and Ecology, and she's also the founder-director of the Data-Driven Enviro Policy Lab, an interdisciplinary group that innovates and applies quantitative approaches to pressing environmental issues. Dr. Xu is contributing author to the 2022 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment Report, and she is the lead author of the 2018 United Nations Emissions Gap Report. We are delighted that she's here tonight to share her expertise in the science and action of how we can avoid catastrophic climate change. Before Dr. Xu begins, we would like you to use your phones to scan a QR code that is going to appear on the screen and respond to this question. When you hear the phrase climate change, what comes to mind? And as you do that response, we'll welcome Dr. Xu to the podium.
I'm curious to see what everyone is putting in here. I do a similar exercise in my climate change class, and I'm always so surprised every year. Wow, Al Gore. Why not Angel Xu? Okay. I'm wondering if that's my parents that put in Al Gore. Okay. I'm sure Al will be very flattered by this word cloud, so we should certainly make sure we share it with him. Okay, well, while that's going, I just want to thank Matt for the really kind introduction, and for Furman, the Riley Institute, and Ollie for inviting me here today. It's really a homecoming of sorts, because I was actually born in Greenville, South Carolina, and I lived here until I graduated from high school. I have so many fond memories of Furman's campus, because I actually spent every weekend playing in the Carolina Youth Symphony, my violin, in Daniel Music Hall. And the summer before my junior year, I lived on campus as part of the Governor's School for the Arts. And also, my family, we would spend many evenings listening to the summer concerts by the lake. And so I don't know if you can see the funny faces that my sister and I were making. And it was not the time of iPhones, so my options were pretty limited. So thanks, Mom. But in the time that I was born in Greenville, South Carolina, nearly 40 years ago, a lot has changed. And I'm not just talking about the downtown area in Greenville, which, oh my gosh, it looks so much different from when I was growing up here. But global concentrations of carbon dioxide emissions have increased from 343 parts per million to over 418 parts per million. During this time, global average temperatures have also increased as well. In Greenville, South Carolina, we're now experiencing, on average, 1.57 degrees Celsius higher compared to 1950 to 1980 baseline levels. And in fact, 19 of the 20 hottest years ever recorded have happened since 2001. In this figure, we have monthly average temperature anomalies. Every single line represents a different year. That white line is a baseline, and so all the years below then probably my parents would remember, so 1974, 1965, 1971. All of the years above the white line are temperatures and years that we've lived through, all of us, since then. 2016 was the hottest year on record ever. Last year, 2021, was the 6th hottest year on record. In fact, scientists have had to redefine what we even mean by a typical climate, and that's because these 30-year baselines that I have pictured here, what scientists refer to as climate normals, have become completely meaningless. And that's because you can see the colors change in these maps. And now we're here in this dark red map, where virtually every part of the United States is a degree Fahrenheit hotter than it was a century ago. In the last decade, we've experienced unprecedented, some of the warmest temperatures in the last 2,000 years. Each of the previous decades has exceeded temperatures from the preceding decade since pre-industrial levels. So what's happening? Why are we seeing these warming temperature trends? Well, I'm sure we are all familiar with the greenhouse gas effect. Scientists have known about it for centuries, and many of you probably learned this in elementary school. And so as this animation shows, greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide in our atmosphere are trapping some of the sun's energy that should be re-radiated back out into space. And instead, like our cars, or if you have a greenhouse, what's happening is that infrared radiation, that heat, is coming off from the surface of our planet, and it's being trapped by those greenhouse gases and re-radiated back down to the planet's surface, making it hotter. And what humans are doing, we're adding to the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, primarily through our energy systems. When we generate power and electricity and heat to power our factories and our homes, that's generating greenhouse gas emissions. Transportation, as well, is adding another 14%. And the United States, that number is actually much higher. It's about a third of global emissions. Manufacturing, construction adds another 13%. And then agriculture and land use change adds another 15%. So when we convert natural landscapes and forests into built environments, cities, and also to pasture land, we're releasing the carbon that's stored in those lands and in those forests back into the atmosphere. And so what we're doing, as you can see in this video animation, is we're disturbing this naturally occurring phenomenon that makes it possible for us to live on Earth by disturbing this natural carbon cycle of our planet. And so through our industrial activities, when we burn fossil fuels like coal, natural gas, and oil, that's releasing what took centuries for our lands and our oceans to sequester in the form of fossil fuels back into the atmosphere within seconds. And so if we think about the carbon cycle as a carbon budget, this is what it would look like. And so we should have equal amounts of carbon being released, fossil fuels, deforestation, and counterbalanced by what the oceans and lands could sequester. But what humans are doing is we are essentially disturbing this delicate carbon balance, and we're putting more carbon back into the atmosphere through deforestation, through combustion of fossil fuels, than our lands and our oceans can actually absorb. And so as a result, the temperature of the Earth has to increase in order to match that additional energy that's being absorbed by the carbon in our atmosphere. So now I just gave you a 5-minute primer on climate change science. Usually it takes me weeks in my climate change class to get through, but I was given a very tall order to give you a primer on climate science. So let's now look at some of the impacts of climate change. And many of these I don't have to describe to you because you know that they're already happening. Just this past summer alone, heat waves were occurring all over North America and Europe. Many countries were experiencing triple-digit record temperatures. These are just a few of the headlines that a quick Google search revealed. From France to parts of Europe to the Pacific Northwest, they all experienced record-breaking temperatures. In China right now, they are going on day 70 of triple-digit record heat waves. The news is already calling it one of the worst heat waves in history. You can see in this satellite video in 2018, when Europe last experienced a major heat wave, essentially the green landscapes turned brown from prolonged heat and extreme temperatures. Wildfires, too, are also becoming much more frequent and prevalent occurrences. I have friends that live in California where they just know every September there's going to be wildfires and they may need to evacuate. Australia, Brazil, these are all places that due to drier temperatures, less precipitation, are making wildfires much more frequent. And that's resulting in huge economic, natural, and social losses. Droughts as well, due to drier conditions due to climate change and less precipitation, are also afflicting major parts of the world, driving food shortages and reducing agricultural output. At the same time, we're seeing record flooding in Kentucky, Mississippi right now, experiencing record flooding because in climate change, what happens, for every degree of Celsius warming, the atmosphere can hold 7% more water vapor. And so that's increasing precipitation in many parts of the world, leading to devastating floods. I don't know if anyone's been following the news in Pakistan, but now 33 million people have been displaced due to the recent flooding. It's incredibly serious. And then I think most recently, we've all experienced supply chain crunches and crises due to the pandemic, but they're also the result of climate change as well. With these flash floods, precipitation events, that's disrupting transportation networks, ability to transport goods along supply chains. This one headline is talking about the global microchip shortage being the result of heat waves in China. And then also some of our beloved food staple crops, chilies, coffee, and wine. All of these agricultural products have experienced shortages because of droughts and prolonged temperatures. So all of these impacts on climate change are expected to worsen under climate change. But we know also that these impacts are not necessarily felt equally across the world. This is from one of my favorite photographers, Johnny Miller, his Unequal Scenes project. And this is Mexico City. And in this one image, we see juxtaposed a much wealthier neighborhood here on the right. You can see the trees, the nice houses, the really nice sports facilities, the soccer pitches, and the tennis courts. And that's right next to this other neighborhood that's clearly much less wealthy, much more dense, and you have this informal soccer pitch. These scenes are common all throughout the world. And what we found in our own research is that these disparities in infrastructure, in housing, and environmental amenities like green spaces and trees also translate into environmental inequalities and environmental injustices. This is from a study that we did last summer with the city of Raleigh. We sent citizen scientists on their bikes and also on foot and in their cars to measure the temperature differences within the city of Raleigh, North Carolina. And so you can see, in some cases, a 10-degree Fahrenheit temperature differential between the red and the blue areas. And so these disparities and these differences in temperature correlate with income over here on the right. The darkest green and blue areas are some of the wealthiest neighborhoods, and they so happen to have the highest percentage of tree cover. You can see in dark green in the middle, and that translates into some of the coolest temperatures in white in the city. And so not only are people in the poorer, less wealthy neighborhoods exposed to higher levels of, or they have less tree cover, but they're also exposed to higher levels of urban heat. And that translates into all sorts of environmental health conditions, such as increased risk of cardiovascular disease, stroke, asthma. In Greenville, South Carolina, we've also found similar patterns in environmental disparities and inequalities. So over here on the right, in dark blue, are the census tracts with the greatest percentage of people living below poverty. And then on the right, in dark purple, are the percentage of census tracts with higher percentage of minorities living. And you can see that in both of these cases, the poorest populations and the communities with the highest percentage of minorities are located in the hottest areas of the city of Greenville, South Carolina, in dark red. What we found is that it's not just cities here and there that have these same patterns of environmental racism or environmental inequality, but actually in our research we found that in 97% of major US cities we see these same patterns where minorities and people living below the poverty line are exposed to a full degree Celsius higher of urban heat than their white and their wealthy counterparts. So what do we do? What does the science tell us needs to happen in order to stop these worrying trends? Well, if we take a look at this figure, the blue line here shows our historic emissions. And yes, they've grown precipitously, as you saw in global carbon dioxide concentrations. Right now, this yellow line shows where we're headed if we continue to do nothing on climate change, business as usual. The good news is that in 2015, national governments came together and they agreed on the Paris Climate Agreement and set a global target to prevent global temperature rise from exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. To get there, this is the task at hand. We have to take a nosedive, a cliff dive of emissions and get to net zero emissions by 2050. And so scientists have called this the carbon law. And what happens is that starting in 2030, actually by 2030, and every decade after that, we have to have our global carbon emissions until we get to net zero emissions by 2050. And only then will we have a 66% chance of actually meeting that 1.5 degree target. If we don't, so the current policies where we're headed, this is in blue here. So national governments, they made their pledges, they said what they were going to do on climate change, and it really only gets us to here, this blue line. Just a slight deviation from the yellow business as usual line. And so that's really leaving a 29 to 32 gigaton annual gap between where we're headed, these current national policies, and where we need to go in order to stave off the most catastrophic effects of climate change. So that's a pretty tall ask. But if we continue on this business as usual trajectory, we are looking at a 3.6 degrees Celsius warming world. That's a median estimate by 2100. And at that point, if we look at this animation of sea level rise, the consequences in terms of rising ocean levels, which are anticipated to be around 1 meter by the end of the century, will mean that half of Florida disappears from the map, as well as coastal North and South Carolina. Okay, so now I've sufficiently depressed you. You're probably wondering, I thought she was supposed to be optimistic and give us some hope about climate solutions. Isn't that why we're here? Well, yes. So I am now going to share some of the insights from the latest scientific assessment, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which just released its 6th assessment report this past year. And so I was one of the scientists that contributed to the 3rd working group on mitigation. So how do we actually reduce our emissions? What are the solutions that are out there? And we'll have lots of opportunity during the panel for our local experts to talk about locally what we can do here in Greenville in South Carolina. But I wanted to share with you some of the highlights from my perspective from this report to hopefully give you a little bit of that optimism. Well, I think one of the biggest conclusions from this report that I found the most exciting is the falling cost of renewable energy and the increase in the amount of renewable energy that's being installed worldwide. So if we take a look at these numbers, we see that since 2010, there have been precipitous declines, up to 85% in the cost of solar photovoltaic power, concentrated solar, offshore and onshore wind. This is just incredible. And if we take a look at this slide, the blue lines here show the increase in the worldwide capacity of these technologies. So governments and businesses, they're adopting these technologies, they're installing them in favor of fossil-fired technology. In fact, in 2020, there was 260 gigawatts globally that was installed in renewable energy. This was a record and beat the 2019 number by 50%. And if we look at just last year alone, in terms of global renewable electricity capacity that was built out, 80% came from wind and solar alone. So that, to me, provides a lot of optimism. Now we have renewable energy, it's now cheap, and countries and other actors are actually implementing and taking advantage of this very easy solution on climate change. So I'm putting this figure from the IPCC, not because I want you all to go blind and lose your eyesight, but just to show you, these are all different technologies that we evaluated as part of this chapter that are available today, that are actually cost effective today that we can implement to tackle climate change. From more energy efficient appliances in our homes, to more fuel efficient vehicles, to reducing food waste. These are all things that we can do, and many of these options are less than $20 a ton in order to implement. So all of the options in blue are those that are now cheap and affordable and available to tackle climate change. The ones in orange actually can yield net cost savings. So to me, there's a lot of optimism here in this graph, and it just shows us that tackling climate change doesn't need to be expensive, it doesn't need to be costly, and it's not something that's far off in the future that we don't have the ability to take advantage of today. So to me, there's a lot of optimism in this figure. The second bucket of solutions, and this is where the chapters were that I contributed most towards, is a new band of actors that are coming up and emerging, including cities and states, also businesses, financial institutions, to fill in and narrow that 29 to 32 gigaton emissions gap. So in 2015, the Paris Agreement, and I have an excerpt pulled out here, officially recognized for the first time the contributions of all levels of government and businesses to help to tackle climate change. So this was a really big deal. It really shifted the whole way we think about tackling climate change from a global perspective. And so what that meant is that you had Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo and former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg. They teamed up with hundreds of governors and mayors all across the world, and they formed coalitions like I have mapped here from the Global Covenant of Mayors, which has close to 12,000 mayors around the world, all coming together to tackle climate change. You have an initiative called RE100, where you have businesses that are committed to 100% renewable electricity consumption. You also have in the United States, these coalitions of states like the United States Climate Alliance, America is All In. During 2016 to 2020, where we had no national climate change policy, these mayors and governors were stepping up and saying, wait a second, we're still into the Paris Agreement, we're still gonna take action on climate change, even if our national government is not. And what our research group has done is we have collected data on all of these different actions. So this is one of the maps of our subnational actors, close to 13,000 of them. And many of them are actually taking actions that are more ambitious than the national governments that they're located within. And so there's a whole lot of potential for these actors to help fill in some of these policy gaps that we're seeing that national governments, where national governments are lagging. And so here we've quantified the potential. And so just in 10 high-emitting countries, so that includes the US, China, India, Brazil, the EU, and South Africa, a few other countries. We looked at 6,000 of these actors at the subnational scale and around 2,000 businesses. And this figure now you should all have memorized and imprinted in your memory. This is our historic emissions and trajectories and where we need to go to 1.5 degrees here in this figure. And what we found is that all of these actions, when we add them together, can lead to an additional 1 to 2 gigatons on top of what national governments have pledged in 2030. So that may not sound like a lot. It's only around 4% of global total emissions, or Japan and Canada's 2018 emissions, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. It's just in 10 countries and a couple of thousand actors. And I recently attended in November the Glasgow COP26 climate negotiations, and we have now witnessed a sea change where thousands of these businesses and financial institutions and cities and states are stepping up, and now they're taking their own net zero and decarbonization goals. And so through initiatives like the UN's Race to Zero campaign, they are stepping up and saying, we're going to decarbonize, we're going to make a net zero pledge, and this has become the new norm. So there's a lot of excitement. This is really encouraging, and in fact, on our net zero tracker, this is the list of actors that we have so far recorded that have signed up to one of these pledges. So 1,600 cities, 146 regions, 700 of the world's largest companies, and 400 of the world's largest investors. So this is all really exciting that everyone is now seeing climate change not as a risk, but also as an opportunity. And we saw the numbers, the economics, it's all there. I think now the critical piece is to make sure that these actors are actually held accountable, and it's not just greenwashing. It's very easy to say, yes, I will decarbonize, but then not do the hard work to actually achieve those goals. Is anyone a fan of John Oliver? He actually covered this topic of carbon offsets and cited this project as part of that. So that was exactly the topic. We need to hold these actors accountable. And so far, our research has shown that very few of these companies are actually making credible net zero targets or actually making good on what they say they will. So there's a lot of work to be done. The last point I wanted to highlight before we turn over to, clearly from the word cloud, everyone's favorite speaker, is actually the potential from the demand side. So what that means, that's just wonky language for saying all of us, what we can do to actually impact climate change. This is the first time that the IPCC report has the scientific evidence and the numbers to back up the impact that we can have on climate change. 50 to 80% of emissions reductions across different sectors. To me, this was incredibly uplifting and really significant in terms of a finding. So when we change our own consumption and our own behavior patterns, we shift to more sustainable diets, or in our homes, we change out our HVAC systems for heat pumps or switch to induction stoves. If we make our next car an electric vehicle, or like me, I switch to an e-bike to commute to campus every single day, all of these efforts can actually, in aggregate, have a really huge impact. During the pandemic, globally, we saw the single largest reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions, 7.5%. That was the largest reduction ever. And it was largely because we stayed at home, we were teleworking, we were not traveling or driving our cars. So to me, that just shows the huge potential when we all work together, we can make a difference, even though it may seem like, well, who cares if I eat chicken today instead of eating my veggie salad. So I think this was one of the most uplifting pieces on climate change. So I hope that I've given you some of the sobering science, but then also given you some of the optimism for what's happening in terms of current climate change policy and trends, and also the potential for us to make a difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Xu, for laying the groundwork for our conversations and framing our dialogue for the rest of the evening. It's now my pleasure to welcome to the stage a longtime leader in promoting solutions to climate change, former U.S. Representative Bob Inglis, to introduce our next speaker.
Al Gore grew up in Washington, D.C., and in Tennessee, the son of Senator Al Gore Sr. He served in the Vietnam War in the U.S. Army, got elected to the U.S. Congress, got elected to the U.S. Senate, In 1992, was elected Vice President of the United States, re-elected in 1996 with Bill Clinton as president, and then was the nominee of the Democratic Party for president in 2000, a race that he won in the popular vote, but lost in the Electoral College. Vice President Gore made a concession speech that night that I would commend to everyone. It's available on YouTube. It's timeless and actually fits our political moment quite well. After he conceded that race, he continued working on his signature issue, which is the race to solve climate change, writing the book An Inconvenient Truth, producing the movie by the same name, winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007, along with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for that work on climate change. And so it would probably surprise Vice President Gore to know that I, in every presentation I make to conservatives that we're trying to reach on climate change at republican.org, reference him literally in the first moments of that presentation. Invariably, I say, for my first 6 years in Congress, I said that climate change was nonsense. I didn't know anything about it, except that Al Gore was for it. And inasmuch as I represented one of the reddest districts in the reddest state of the nation, that was the end of the inquiry. But then I go on to say, okay, so I admit that was pretty ignorant, but that's the way it was for my first 6 years in Congress. And so, Mr. Vice President, for that willful ignorance, I would ask your forgiveness and the forgiveness of anyone in this audience that was a constituent of mine during those 6 years when we could have been making progress. And, you know, it's also something that I should thank Vice President Gore for, which is accepting people like me into the climate conversation. Somebody who disputed climate science. But since a 6-year hiatus and then a return to Congress and then getting tossed out of Congress in 2010, Vice President Gore has modeled the grace which is so essential in this moment to receive into the conversation about climate change people like me who disputed climate change. And you know, there's something else that I'd like to thank Vice President Gore for here tonight, and that is that speech that I just mentioned, his concession speech in the year 2000. He quoted his father for the proposition that defeat can serve as well as victory to shake the soul and let the glory out. Well, that night, Vice President Gore let the glory out. He respected the rule of law, accepting the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in a case that he had disputed. He graciously conceded to President-elect George W. Bush. He put country first over party. And I realize that's not the topic of conversation here tonight. Or maybe it is the conversation here tonight. Because in order to solve climate change, it takes the reconciliation, the coming together that Vice President Gore spoke of that night, that very difficult night, 35 days after Election Day in the year 2000. So for all those things, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Vice President Al Gore.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bob. Thank you. I hope that you can all hear me. Thank you very much, Bob, and hello, everyone. And I want to say to Congressman Inglis, thank you not only for those overly generous and very gracefully phrased sentences. I appreciate all of that very much. But thank you for your personal courage in transcending partisanship and transcending your own disappointment and finding a purpose for your life that has been joined to the same purpose that I and Angel Shu and so many others have been dedicated to. Thank you so much. And I want to endorse Bob's sentiment that in some ways the need for all of us as Americans to transcend partisanship more than we've seemingly been able to do these last few years it is connected to the solutions to the climate crisis. The environment used to be a fully bipartisan issue. And I won't go through chapter and verse, but some of you know this was never a partisan issue, and it perhaps can once again be an issue that brings people together. In any case, I'm so glad to be joining you tonight for this important series of discussions. I want to thank Furman University and the Riley Institute for hosting these conversations, and thank you for inviting me to speak with you about the climate crisis and its solutions. And I want to particularly thank the distinguished Furman graduate who invited me to join this evening, Dick Riley. Dick, I know that you're present this evening, and my goodness, what can I say to this crowd that they don't already know? I was privileged to have you as a colleague in the Clinton-Gore administration, but that was the least of it. That gave me the opportunity to get to know you as a dear friend. I honor you, Dick, and you are one of the public servants I most respect as I think back to all of the men and women with whom I've had the privilege to serve. And I know everybody there understands exactly what I'm saying. But I want to give some of the credit to Furman that educated you. And I've had the privilege to work alongside other Furman alums, Frank Holloman at the Southern Environmental Law Center. I could mention many others, but I want to single out Phyllis Cutno, who is the president and CEO of the nonprofit NGO that I founded years ago, the Climate Reality Project, and with whom I work very closely now. This week, I've been finishing up the 50th Climate Reality Training, this one in Brazil and in Portuguese. I don't speak Portuguese, but they put subtitles up for me, and everybody else spoke Portuguese. And we had 7,200 grassroots climate activists in Brazil sign up for the week-long training there just 6 weeks before their presidential election, by the way. But my overarching point is, obviously, this university has long cultivated outstanding leaders. And I also want to thank Dr. Angel Shu for that excellent overview of the latest climate science. I was only able to hear a little bit of the end of your presentation, Dr. Shu, when I was connected. But thank you for your great work. In the more than 40 years I've been working on this issue, one thing has remained remarkably clear and consistent. The scientists have been absolutely right about the threat to the future of humanity posed by the climate crisis and by our continued use of fossil fuels. Last year, the IPCC stated in its clearest declaration yet that it is, quote unquote, unequivocal that our actions are responsible for the climate crisis. And yet, despite the warnings of all of these distinguished scientists around the world, and despite the evidence of the growing impacts that Mother Nature highlights for us almost every single day, you know, every night on the TV news is like a nature hike through the book of Revelation. Right now, today, more than 1,100 people killed in Pakistan by the flooding there, a 400% increase in the downpours that are typical of the monsoon season there. China, a part of China being devastated by 2 months of temperatures above 104 degrees, as high as 113 degrees, devastating agriculture, industry, hydroelectric power. And I could go on, of course, Lake Mead, Lake Powell, you know, Angel's covered a lot of this, so I won't. But in spite of all of that, we continue to pump 162 million tons of human-caused global warming pollution into the atmosphere every day, as if it were an open sewer. Allow me to invite you to take a look at this image behind me. It's a view of the Earth's horizon from the International Space Station. And I'm showing it because it provides a critically important perspective. When we go out and stand on the ground, look up at the sky from our vantage point on the Earth's surface, the sky seems like a vast and limitless expanse. But as you can see from this image, in reality, it's an extremely thin shell. And that shell protects all life on Earth as we know it. If you could drive an automobile straight up in the air at the same speeds you'd use on Interstate 85 from the surface of the planet straight up in the air, you'd reach the top of that blue line in as little as 5 to 7 minutes. And above you, it would be impossible to breathe without an oxygen mask and a tank. And below you are all, would be all of the accumulated global warming pollution, the emissions that we are pumping into that thin shell of atmosphere every single day. And it lingers there about 100 years for each molecule on average. And the accumulated amount that we've put into that blue line now traps as much extra heat energy as would be released by 600,000 first-generation atomic bombs exploding on Earth every 24 hours. On average, as I say, it stays there for 100 years, so it does mount up. And unfortunately, as you've already heard this evening, the consequences of all this extra trapped heat energy are all around us, all around the world. Ice is melting faster and, well, anyway, thus far, in spite of all these consequences, we have yet to really meaningfully deploy the solutions to this crisis at the speed and scale necessary to prevent catastrophic damage and to stop the damage we're already seeing. However, I am ultimately very optimistic about our ability to solve this crisis. Just as the world scientists have accurately projected the impacts that we're now facing, and the fact that they've been right about what they told us in the past would be happening today should cause us to pay more attention to what they're saying would happen if we don't start cutting back on these emissions. But these scientists have also helped to provide us with the solutions that we need. In fact, the IPCC has clearly outlined the pathway that we can and must take to achieve the goal of the historic Paris Agreement just 7 years ago to limit increases in global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius and avert the worst civilization-ending impacts of this crisis. And in order to get there, our work is urgent. In order to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, that means we've got to cut these emissions in half by the end of this decade. And that means we've got less than 8 years to do that. But the good news is that scientists and engineers and other experts, including those at the International Energy Agency, agree that not only do we have all the solutions that we need today to achieve that goal, we have the proven deployment strategies that we already know work. They've been used. We know how to scale them up. There's no barrier to it. Indeed, we are right now in the early stages of a sustainability revolution that is occurring at the scale of the Industrial Revolution, coupled with the speed of the digital revolution. It's already beginning to reshape the world, transforming our relationship to businesses, to the environment, and to one another. Companies are reinventing transportation, for example, through electric cars buses, and other forms of mobility. South Carolina is a part of this revolution. They are reimagining agriculture with the adoption of regenerative agriculture approaches and even alternatives to meat. And they are applying digital tools to reduce energy consumption and better integrate renewable energy into electrical grids, retooling workplaces for greater productivity. But nowhere is this revolution more visible than in the field of renewable energy. Here's an example. 1 year before the Paris Agreement in 2014, just before those leaders came together, electricity from solar and wind was cheaper than electricity from new coal and gas plants in only 1% of the world. 5 years later, electricity from solar and wind was the cheapest electricity in more than 2/3 of the world. And within the next 2 years, that'll be true in virtually 100% of the world. In many nations, the ever-increasing cost advantages of clean energy are leading to the replacement and early retirement of existing coal and gas facilities, even if they have decades of useful life remaining. For 60% of the coal plants around the world right now today, it's already cheaper to just shut them down and replace them with new solar and wind. And that's going to be true for nearly 100% of all the coal plants in the world by the end of this decade. The market for fossil fuels is rapidly shrinking. Likewise, the geopolitical and economic risks of fossil fuel dependence have become abundantly clear, particularly in this past year since February. As the world grapples with rising costs, it is clear that making the switch to renewable energy and sustainable technologies can be a key tool in helping governments also tackle inflation. This sustainability revolution is massively deflationary. Those utilities, by the way, that have switched to solar and wind, their electricity costs are going down. The ones that are still using gas and coal, their electricity rates are going up. Now, another factor here that's weighing heavy on all of our minds, Vladimir Putin's abhorrent and immoral war in Ukraine has clearly illuminated the threat to both energy security and to democracy that's posed by our dependence on petrostates like Russia. As many experts have said, Putin's war in Ukraine is an oil war, a fossil fuel war. It's perpetuated by the profits of Russia's fossil fuel industry. We're financing his war right now by continuing to buy oil and gas. Putin is, for his part, attempting to blackmail nations in the European Union that have unwisely grown too dependent on Russia's oil and gas. They were warned, former President Reagan warned against Europe becoming so dependent on Russian fossil fuel, but they ignored those warnings, and now they're seeing that they should have heeded those warnings. In the face of these challenges, we must embrace this moment as an opportunity for a global epiphany, not moral cowardice and reckless indifference to the future of humanity. We can't double down on existing self-destructive habits, but instead we have the chance to seize this opportunity to usher in a cleaner and more equitable future. You know, former President Harry Truman once said, he said, I spend 95% of my time as president trying to convince people to do what they damn well ought to be doing in their own self-interest anyway. And I know Angel Shue and all these climate scientists certainly feel that. Now, at the last international climate negotiations in Glasgow, world leaders announced some significant new pledges to curb emissions. As of today, 74% of all of the global warming pollution comes from countries that have set net zero pledges. Earlier this year, there were serious concerns about whether nations were doing enough to achieve those goals or whether we had begun to backslide, particularly as governments grappled with the impact of Russia's invasion in Ukraine. But I believe we have reached the long-awaited political tipping point on the climate crisis. In the face of geopolitical and economic instability, world leaders and business leaders alike are now beginning to prioritize climate action. Governments in Europe are responding to Putin's threats by doubling down on long-term policies that will speed their transition to clean energy. Australia has just not long ago elected a pro-climate government. And Phyllis Cutnose and my Climate Reality Project has been very, very active in Australia. And we're active in Brazil right now with their election coming up. And Australia, then after the election, immediately advanced climate legislation that would require significant emissions reductions, very similar to what we've just seen here. And Brazil, I mentioned, another country where climate is on the ballot in a major upcoming election, and it's poised to move from climate laggard to climate leader. And of course, here in the United States, at long last, we have crossed an important threshold with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. This law represents the biggest investment in climate solutions in the entire history of the United States by far, with $369 billion in funding for clean energy, energy efficiency, environmental justice, land conservation, regenerative agriculture, and more. And importantly, these are long-term investments. The clean energy tax credits included in the Inflation Reduction Act are in place for at least 10 years. In fact, the production tax credit for renewable energy will only be phased out once we achieve a 75% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from electricity production. This law now also includes hugely important measures to reduce methane emissions. It has a methane tax in effect. And the methane emissions remain in the atmosphere for less time than CO2 emissions, but they can be more than 80 times as potent molecule for molecule in trapping the heat. This law's methane fee and the funding to clean up leaking drill sites will play a crucial role in reducing emissions in the near term. Multiple independent assessments agree that this law is going to help reduce U.S. emissions by somewhere between 42% and almost 50%. Now, for those of you in the audience who are like me and have identified some things in this law that you don't like, yes, they're there, but here we are in a representative democracy where we've got to have some compromises to move forward. And for every ton of emissions increase that Joe Manchin was able to get with, well, I appreciate Joe Manchin, but for every ton of emissions increase, there are 24 tons of emission decreases. So that's pretty good compromise. And I'm optimistic that with these incentives in place, the market for clean energy and sustainable alternatives is likely to grow even more rapidly, leading to even steeper emissions reductions. Not only that, it will also reduce the amount of money that Americans spend on energy by $50 billion in the next decade. It's going to create more than 1 million good new jobs and will save lots of lives by reducing the deadly co-pollution that comes from burning fossil fuels and is poisoning so many communities, especially communities of color and low-income communities. Environmental justice is a key part of this. But of course, we know that this crisis is not going to be solved with these actions alone. There is much more work that we've got to do, particularly for those communities that are on the front lines of climate impacts and have faced generations of environmental injustice. But I believe strongly that from here, we will not turn backwards. As I've noted, we have arrived at this tipping point thanks to the significant cost reductions in climate solutions and the increasingly severe impacts of on our warming planet that everybody sees so clearly now. But there is a third factor that has pushed us to this point, and that is the tireless efforts of scientists, climate advocates, and especially young people who have used their voices to encourage and facilitate change and to demand change. As with many of the morally based social movements that have come before it, the climate movement has persevered in the face of no after no after no. But to quote the great American poet Wallace Stevens, he wrote these lines: "After the final no, there comes a yes, and on that yes, the future world depends." Our future world depends on you. And I'm here to speak to you, not just to impart information and hope that it's interesting. I'm here to recruit you. We need your help. We all need to work together to protect the important progress we've made, and we then need to build on it. It's not enough to reach this tipping point. We have to cross it, because as we do, we're going to make a huge difference. In fact, included in the latest IPCC report is a piece of overwhelmingly good news. According to the latest climate models, once the world reaches true net zero emissions, global temperatures will stop going up with a lag time of as little as 3 to 5 years. And if we stay at true net zero, about half of the human-caused CO2 emissions will fall out of our atmosphere and be absorbed into the upper ocean and trees in about 30 years. It's as if we have a switch that we can flip in order to stop the worsening of the climate crisis and start the long healing process. We know that, regrettably, too much damage has already been done, and some of it's not recoverable. But we've got to move from where we are. And what the science makes clear is that we can stop temperatures from going up more, and we can start this healing process. But to do it, we've got to maintain the political will in both parties and make it, as Bob Inglis said, bipartisan and nonpartisan, because we fought for a long time to get to this point. Now, in closing, let me just say, if you ever doubt that we as Americans have the political will to solve this crisis, please remember that political will is itself a renewable resource, and we can renew it each and every day. And I want to thank the Riley Institute for doing just that. Thank you, and God bless you.
And thank you, Vice President Gore, for the inspirational words and for your leadership. We're so glad you could join us tonight. If there's one thing that we might keep in mind then when we hear about this notion of political will is that, and I think this is emphasized in Dr. Shu's lecture as well, is that the innovation and technology that we need to save the world is here. It's just a matter of acting. And so to further this thread, I'd like to now invite our panelists to the stage. We'll welcome back Dr. Shu, and she'll be joined by John Lanier and Stinson Woodward Ferguson. I'm particularly excited about this panel. One of the other threads I think we've seen is that this is a global crisis. The solutions span from national and global policy to local action, and the impacts are felt locally. And so if you've ever had a class with me, you were probably sick of all my theoretical frameworks and Dr. Cohen's frameworks. We spent a lot of time thinking about scale and working across scale. And I think tonight we have a nice panel that can help us think about what it means to act from local through state through national policy approaches. I'm going to walk away from the podium, and hopefully my mic is on this time. How am I doing? All right. So I'm joined here by Dr. Angel Shu, who we've gotten to know. We have John Lanier, the head of the Ray Anderson Foundation and founding member of Drawdown Georgia, a movement designed to scale the most effective climate solutions for the state of Georgia. And also Stinson Woodward Ferguson, an attorney focusing on environmental law and a certified sustainability consultant. She was a South Carolina Energy Staff Attorney and then Associate Attorney for the Southern Environmental Law Center, and she currently serves on Greenville's Green Ribbon Advisory Council. So welcome everybody to the stage, and thanks for joining us tonight. So we just heard from Dr. Hsu about the huge crisis we face, the challenging nature of our response and the recommendations of the IPCC, and Vice President Gore has given us some reasons for optimism as well. John, if you don't mind, could you please tell us a little bit about Drawdown Georgia, how it connects with what we've heard so far this evening, and what you are learning about what states can do to mitigate climate change?
Absolutely. Thank you, Matt. And good to be with all of you. Drawdown Georgia is an initiative that came out of a very simple question, a question that echoes a question that you saw on the screen. At the end of Dr. Hsu's presentation, there was the question, what can I do? Our question was, what can Georgia do? Because we have this full suite of solutions, so many things that can help to reduce the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but it turns out that not every solution works perfectly everywhere. Wouldn't we want to know, if we were committed to building a coalition in the state of Georgia to advance climate solutions, which ones work best? And so our foundation funded a group of researchers spanning Georgia Tech, the University of Georgia, Emory University, and Georgia State to answer that question. And their research, released nearly 2 years ago in October of 2020, identified 20 high-impact climate solutions spanning 5 different sectors: electricity, transportation, buildings and materials, land sinks, and food and agriculture, an often forgotten piece of the climate puzzle. And they showed that if the state of Georgia was able to scale up these solutions, all of which exist today, to their achievable potential this decade, we could reduce our state's carbon footprint by 1/3. Now, this is best-in-class academic research, published in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences. It is legit, and it is a roadmap that is perfect for our state, and maybe, because of similarities, perfect for our region here in the Southeast. Now we know what to prioritize. The work is to get people to prioritize them, to build a movement around climate solutions within the state of Georgia, a movement that spans political parties and shows how nonpartisan this whole thing should be. Because it turns out that the research team didn't just model carbon reduction potential, which nerds like me love to geek out on, but it turns out doesn't resonate with the typical Georgian. They also wanted to know, what do these climate solutions, like electric vehicles and rooftop solar, like composting and reduced food waste, like reforestation, what do they mean for the other things that Georgians care about? Issues that go beyond carbon. And so now we also know which climate solutions advance equity, and the issues to be worried about to make sure that as we scale solutions, we do so in an inclusive way. We know which solutions have wins in human health, which ones can enhance our natural environment, which ones can create the most jobs. All of these things mean that we can make a case to everyone in the state of Georgia why they should care about climate solutions and why they should join in trying to make the state of Georgia a leader in scaling those solutions. That, in a nutshell, is what Drawdown Georgia is.
It's quite the nutshell. Stinson, you know what's happening in Greenville, and through your work with the Southern Environmental Law Center are also familiar with work across the state. And so hearing from John about Drawdown Georgia, I'm curious what your insights might be about what it might mean to have a similar movement in South Carolina.
Well, it may not be called Drawdown South Carolina, what we're doing around here, but we certainly have, I let my colleague know as we were in the green room beforehand, I perused Drawdown Georgia's website and was thoroughly impressed with the team you have on board, the optical diversity, the disciplinary diversity, skill sets. I love the institutions you have involved. I'm a UGA law grad, so that's certainly a factor in it. But we've got that here in South Carolina. It obviously wouldn't look exactly like what Drawdown Georgia looks like, but we've got the expertise. We've got the research. As I believe former Vice President Gore stated, we've heard from several people, so I can't remember who said it, the research has been done. And we've got it here. There's so many great things going on in South Carolina, specifically down at the coast. There's a lot going on down there. There's a lot going on here. We've got a lot going on at University of South Carolina, a lot going on here at Furman that I've been exposed to and appreciate. So we've got what we need. Bringing people together in a more concerted effort is what we're lacking. And it will take bravery, it will take pooling of funding, and it will take the suspension of some egos to make that happen, and the ability for people to want to get on board and just do the work, maybe get a picture on a website, but not necessarily get a trophy for what they're doing. So I certainly think, I know there's a potential for that, and we've got separate balls rolling, but I'd love to see there be more collaboration, especially since I've worked on environmental issues in the low country, and right before COVID hit, I moved back up to the upstate where I'm from. The lack of communication and collaboration, not only among our environmental nonprofits, but also among in the legal profession and with our community efforts that are going on, everything from top to bottom, we need more collaboration.
Great. I think that's a nice tone to touch on, is the time is ripe and we can do this, but let's not be naive. It's not going to be easy. John, I wonder if you could share some words of advice for us. In what ways can Georgia, South Carolina, and Greenville have the greatest impact in the shortest amount of time? Because while we're trying to get our ducks in a row, we're rapidly running up against this 2030 and then ultimately 2050 deadline.
It comes down largely in the short term to economics. It turns out there's lots of things we have to be concerned about, but the biggest consistent barrier that I see is finance, access to these sorts of solutions. That happens at the grand scale when you talk about, oh, what does it take to get these massive new solar fields sited and built, but it also comes down to the small scale of how do we help reduce energy burden by putting solar panels not on someone's roof, on the people's roofs in our communities who would benefit most from having an ultra-low cost of energy above them. So we have to be prioritizing the opportunities to drive capital wherever possible, and that means governmental capital, it means corporate capital, it means philanthropic capital, it means even personal capital, people looking at what I can do today to scale a solution. You need to look at where you can put your money and where you can vote for your representatives to put their money to accelerate the transition towards the whole suite of solutions that we know are ready to go right now.
So then what would you then tell the folks in the audience tonight where they can most direct their work to help make change?
It's so unique to each person. Ask the question, where are you dedicated to engaging in all of this? I mean, I can get down into the weeds of, oh, when Georgia, well, you know, the largest solution from a gigaton reduction standpoint, it's utility scale solar. And so can we make sure that the regulatory bodies are looking in the direction of more sited solar? That is an advocacy play, but some people may not want to call up their elected representatives. That may not be how you feel engaged in this work. So ask that of yourself, learn, and then act in the ways that you feel called to, that you feel are going to make a meaningful difference in your own life.
Stinson, Angel mentioned during her talk the role of cities and urban areas in the new climate movement. As a member of the environmental law community, and then also as a member of Greenville's Green Ribbon Advisory Council, which advises the city of Greenville on how to be more sustainable, for those of you who aren't familiar with the organization, I'm curious how to become more sustainable at the Greenville level. Actually, let me backtrack, sorry. What did you hear from Angel that you think Greenville can do to become a city that leads in mitigating climate change?
I think Greenville's already doing a lot. We could be doing more. And that's why I've got my iPad up here. With respect to the Green Ribbon Advisory Committee, I'm just wrapping up my first term. This fall I will, first 2-year term, and we're doing so many things. The city is doing so many things that I didn't want to leave anything out. Many of you may know Charleston and Columbia both have climate action plans. Greenville is working on one. The city of Greenville is working on one, so that will be forthcoming. And the Green Ribbon Advisory Committee, we met, I think it was last week, and we'll be drafting a request to City Council for them to issue a resolution. You know, any kind of climate action plan would need the endorsement of City Council in order to get appropriate staffing and resources devoted to that. So we're working on that as well. We wrapped up Sustainable Greenville, that the city of Greenville partnered with the Shy Institute here at Furman, Shy Institute for Sustainable Communities, which is excellent, on a Sustainable Greenville plan. And we worked on that for about 2 years, and we just voted to approve it, to send it to City Council, so it looks like it's been green lighted. There's 6 categories of recommendations, all of which speak to at least some aspects of Dr. Shu's presentation. Climate and energy, Greenville is working on its first greenhouse gas inventory. In order to know where you want to go, you need to know where you are. So working on that. Also, just city efforts to reduce impact, whether that's LED lighting, whether that's seeking to reduce paper usage within city facilities, whether that's, we've got our first solar installation is the David Helms Community Center. We'll be working on more toward that. The new Greenville Public Works facility is LEED certified, so that's, a lot of positive things, lots of things on transportation that are named in that, and all those things are great, but some of the challenges are the city of Greenville is just a dot in the map of Greenville County. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. I know I'm here to speak on what the city's doing, but the city can't do it all on its own. We need the help of the county, and we need the help of county council in addition to what city council is willing to endorse in order to make that happen. And then in addition to that, most of the commercial activity, most of the vehicles on the roads in the city of Greenville are not people who live in the city of Greenville. So that's a huge challenge, that a lot of the resources that are being enjoyed, appreciated, used, that are located within the city of Greenville are not necessarily being used by people that live in the city. So we're doing a lot. We've got a long way to go. City's also working on a new zoning and development code. That is the next step in the Sustainable Greenville plan. A tree ordinance, speaking to, trying to avoid having large swaths of land that are either concrete covered, lack of tree cover, especially in our lower income neighborhoods. We've enacted a new tree ordinance that was specifically in response to community concerns about how much tree cover it was declining over the years, and that's absolutely in response to, or absolutely because of massive increases in development. And so now there's a new tree ordinance in place. The challenge with that is there's a buyout option. And so in the revision, or the revisitation, if you will, of the new zoning and development code, there will be an effort, I'm told, to try to find ways to disincentivize the buyout option, so it's not just, we don't end up just getting to the same result, and people don't opt to plant more trees, and it's more than just planting trees, it's the right kind of trees. So there are lots of things going on here, but the city can only do so much. It's much bigger than the city of Greenville.
Yeah, I think it's something we can't emphasize enough, is when you look at the city of Greenville's population embedded within a broader metro region, The city, in its regulatory power, really only influences a very small section of the upstate.
Absolutely.
And actually, you've teed me up for my next question, which, thank you. Angel, sometimes advocating for change or just figuring out who can get things done is complicated by multi-level governance. What challenges do we have in cities, counties, and then states when we try to determine where the responsibility lies, who has the power to get things done, and where we want to drive our action?
Well, I think Stinson illustrated this complexity of multi-level governance really well. I mean, she talked about all the problems of having outside residents come into Greenville City and enjoy the amenities, pollute the air, but then not have any consequences in trying to internalize some of those costs. And so, I mean, we're seeing that this is one of the major challenges where you have cities and counties and states and national governments that are all doing different things in the spirit of trying to tackle climate change, but going back to something else that Stinson said, it's uncoordinated. And in our own research, we've also found the same. We've analyzed thousands of climate strategy documents, so it's really exciting because Greenville was missing actually from our database, so that's great to hear that you're working on it because I think that's absolutely a critical first step to tackling the issue. But yeah, we saw very little connection and coordination between these different actions, and it's absolutely critical. That's what the whole Paris Agreement is predicated on. We have these virtuous cycles and of action. And so the idea is that you can have local actions that then can inspire larger actions at the county or the state level, and then eventually also inspire the national level, and then that can help to increase ambition of everyone's efforts over time. And that can really only happen. We can only realize this vision of these virtuous cycles in the Paris Agreement if we can coordinate and work together. So I think that that's really critical. In the example of Raleigh that I showed, when we did that heat mapping study, it was really clear. I probably didn't get to see it very clearly, but there's a deep red line that goes through Raleigh, and that's State Highway 1. And so what City of Raleigh officials said is, we would love to plant trees along that corridor or do something to increase the reflectance of the pavement to make it cooler, but they have no control because it's controlled by the state. And so I think that just reinforces Stinson's point that there's only certain sectors of emissions or certain areas of the economy where you actually have control. And so you really need to be able to coordinate in order to realize, I think, a sum that's greater than the individual parts.
Great, thank you. And then speaking then of this coordination, my impression then, John, of what's happening with Drawdown Georgia is there is now a body that can coordinate diverse actors across sectors, across scale within the state. Could you give any insights about maybe what that success or challenge might look like?
Absolutely. So one of the challenges is that the political stars are not aligned in Georgia to see robust leadership at the state level and often at the city level and the county level. So while we work to influence various policymakers, we're not focused solely on that. In fact, it's not our most significant play. It turns out that you need coordination and collaboration in multiple sectors and then knit them together. So there are two examples I'll share, things that we've created within this Drawdown Georgia ecosystem that are proof points for our theory of change, of how we can build a movement around climate solutions in our state. So one is a partnership with a state-level nonprofit called Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. And they have historically worked with congregations of different faith types from across the state to start green teams and look for ways that these communities of faith can be better stewards of the earth. They have taken the Drawdown Georgia research and packaged it in a way that is relevant to congregations. So Drawdown Georgia congregations, they've got it, and they're running with it. They're leading in that space. The second, and perhaps what will be the most significant example similar to that, is a gathering of the business community. Our friends at the Ray C. Anderson Center for Sustainable Business, it's at Georgia Tech's Business School, they have been convening the Drawdown Georgia Business Compact, which has brought together now 40 different companies, including the big boys, Google, Delta, Coca-Cola, but also companies that are small that you've never heard of that exist entirely within the state of Georgia. One perhaps in the clothing sector, another that's a farm in South Georgia doing regenerative agriculture work. Now we have a community of businesses who have come together for two reasons. One is to state their intention. They have signed on to say that they support the state of Georgia reaching carbon neutrality in accordance with the Paris Climate Agreement. Big businesses making that statement matters. And secondly, they're providing a community of practice, looking for the ways that across the different sectors, those 5 different Drawdown Georgia sectors, they can come together, collaborate on climate solutions. Maybe that looks like bulk purchasing of renewables. Maybe it looks like innovating in some sort of research and development task. Maybe it looks like helping local communities where the businesses have their physical footprint to come along with the journey of building climate solutions. This collaboration that we are seeing begin to happen in the corporate sector is one that I think will have cascading benefits, because we know that corporate America speaks with a really loud voice, and that's true no matter where in our country it is.
Thank you. And while we try to figure out how to organize ourselves in South Carolina, one thing I'm hearing from Stinson is that the city of Greenville is acting and moving. So I'm curious, Angel, if there's any kind of last advice you'd give us as members of the Greenville community.
I mean, I'm just incredibly impressed with the things that Greenville is already doing. I mean, I'm coming from a data perspective, so I was really excited to hear about the greenhouse gas inventory development that you're embarking on. That was actually my first job out of grad school, was training governments and businesses on how to measure and account for their greenhouse gas emissions. So we always said you can't manage what you don't measure, and you can't manage well what you don't measure well. And so it's absolutely fundamental to develop that baseline inventory, see where emissions are occurring, and where you can actually get not just the greenhouse gas reductions, but also the economic savings. And so when we were trying to convince businesses to tackle climate change and to develop these inventories, this is what we would say. When you're reducing your energy consumption, when you're becoming more efficient, you're actually saving money. And that really resonated with a lot of the businesses that we work with. So I think that's a really big piece. And then I'm going to go a little bit policy wonky because I'm a policy scholar, but I think the biggest thing that governments can do is, and this is what we outlined in the IPCC finding, is to develop these choice architectures for citizens and individuals to make the right decisions when it comes to climate change. So providing the right regulatory and the policy context to give those nudges, to nudge people in the right direction, giving them incentives for adopting clean energy or for buying that electric car, for teleworking or reducing food waste. I think that's a huge part of what governments can do. And now, as we heard from Vice President Gore, there is money to do that. The Inflation Reduction Act is going to be huge in providing local governments those finances and those resources to actually be able to develop policies that can flow into the right places. John, as you said, I think that's really encouraging that you all are putting inclusion right at the forefront of designing these actions, because that's absolutely critical, and that's what the Inflation Reduction Act is designed to do, to really target those frontline communities to try to address all of these decades of disparities that we're seeing play out in climate impacts.
Wonderful. All right, John, you're going to help us segue to next week's program.
All right.
You ready?
I'm ready.
All right, so your journey into focusing on what we do to create a more sustainable future is rooted in your family and your grandfather's company. Can you tell us a little bit about Interface Carpet, the company founded by your grandfather, its role in leading the industry in developing products that are carbon neutral from start to finish?
Ray Anderson, I was lucky enough to call him Daddy Ray. He founded Interface in 1973, and by the mid-90s had grown it into the world's largest manufacturer of carpet tile. And it was in the year 1994 when he had an epiphany rooted in the negative environmental impact that his extractive industrial manufacturing company was having on the planet. And he dedicated the last 17 years of his life to making his publicly traded and global industrial manufacturing company as sustainable as possible. And along the way proved that when done right, sustainability can be very good for the bottom line. When Ray passed away, our family through this foundation has worked to carry on his legacy, but so too has Interface. And of their own accord, about 6 years ago, they came to focus in particular on climate as the environmental issue that they wanted to make the most impact on. They launched an initiative called Climate Take Back and have worked to drive what was already a low carbon footprint across their global operations even lower. They began asking questions like, how can we manufacture a carpet tile so that less carbon is in the atmosphere than if it had never been made at all? And so they reformulated even their products to have enough bio-based material in the backing of these carpet tiles so that some of their products, because they're made, have helped sip a tiny bit of carbon out of the atmosphere. It's a statement of intent, and it's a readying for a circumstance when the businesses with the lowest carbon footprint will also win in the marketplace because we will come to value that. Interface is there. And so many businesses can be leading in this space as well. We need companies not just to make global commitments to carbon neutrality, but to do the nitty-gritty, dirty work of figuring out how do we actually change the way we've always done business so that we can be at the leading edge of solving the planet's most pressing challenge.
Thank you. Compelling story. I actually walked on interface carpet yesterday at the Shy Institute. So this is a good moment to mention next week's programming for anyone who would like to visit us, and I hope you do next week as well. Next week we're going to focus on the role that the private sector plays in addressing climate change. We'll hear about innovative practices happening in industry. We'll be visited by Julian Soul, the president of Proterra Transit, and who will tell us about how Proterra buses are changing city transit and other innovative technologies that are in the works at that company. We hear from Castle Knight, Senior VP overseeing sustainability at Milliken, about why Milliken is front and center in the climate movement and what practices they're moving forward as well. In addition, Ethel Bunch with Sustain SC will talk about what's happening across the state of South Carolina. And then in industry, Katie Thomas from the Kearney Institute will talk to us about the role that consumers play in driving companies towards climate action. And then finally, State Senator Tom Davis will be here to bring the legislative lens to help us think about transitioning towards renewable energy. I have one last question to leave the panelists for us tonight, and that is, in 30 seconds or less, what is one thing you would like the people in this audience to walk away with tonight? Stinson?
Don't get distracted, and if you get distracted, don't stay distracted. There's a lot going on in the news, and I try to monitor, to the extent my sanity can withstand it, what's going on in Washington. But my main concern as a South Carolinian and as a native of the upstate are my people. And if it doesn't, the reason I care about all of this is because of the effects that it has on people. That's the only reason I care. That's the only reason I will ever care. And I will not allow any agenda or anything to ever get me distracted enough that I forget about why this matters. And as I think John touched on earlier, figure out what you can do, why you care, and don't get distracted from that why. It's easy to get pulled out of it, but stay authentic.
Thank you.
So for me, what if we get it right? This is not just about averting catastrophe. And to you young people in the audience, what if you get it right? You will build a better world than we've ever had as a species, with ultra low cost energy, with healthier food systems, with more connected communities that are socially just, because that goes along with getting this right. So keep an eye on that dream of building the best world we've ever had.
Oh, those are really good. It's very hard to follow. But I guess I would say that the future is yet to be written. I think that particularly my presentation, and I think to some extent Vice President Gore's, we really gave the sombering reality of what's happening with climate change. And I think it's important, it's so encouraging that all of you spent your time in your evening with us to learn about the issue. I think that's really the first step, to understand the urgency and the extent and the magnitude of the problem ahead of us when it comes to climate change. But at the same time, the future is still yet written. We still have time to turn it around. And as Al Gore said, flip the switch. And so that's what I'm hoping, that we can all flip the switch together.
We have some co-authors in the room.
Yes, please, come collaborate with me. Love it.
All right. Well, thank you to the panelists for helping us tonight. Thank you to all in the audience, and thank you to our students for sharing your talents with us. We'll be back here next week. If you're interested, 6 o'clock, there will be a sustainable food tasting. So please join us early. Thank you.